Welcome to the latest episode of Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Dr. Tamsin Philippa Page, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School. Today we are discussing the impact of generative AI on legal scholarship. And because I am a devout Gen AI hater, as opposed to machine learning programs, generative AI, we are talking about where a prompt is entered to create things rather than machine learning being used to refine an algorithm. Um, I thought it best to get some guests in who have had to deal with the issue of Gen AI and legal scholarship firsthand. So I am joined by Professor Karen Scott of the University of Canterbury in New Zealand and Dr. Camille Goodman, Associate Professor at the Australian National Centre for Oceans, Resources and Security, or ANCORS as I remember it, because I never remember the whole thing unpacked from the acronym, at the University of Wollongong. More importantly, they are the editors of the Ocean Development and International Law Journal and have had to deal with the impact of Gen AI on legal scholarship at scale in this capacity. Before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer reviewed. But before we get down to business, our traditional first question, Karen, Camille, what's your drink?
Well, I'm drinking a gin and tonic because the sun is well over the yardarm in New Zealand. It's the Botanist gin, which is from Islay, in Scotland. I do think the Scottish gins are the best, and it's a grapefruit and thyme tonic.
Uh, the Botanist, I'm never a gin person when I did drink, but the Botanist gin was a favorite of many of my friends who are gin drinkers, so I can heartily support that decision.
And it is Friday afternoon here, and Karen and I have bonded over gin and tonics on a few occasions. Plus, we are discussing AI, so it did seem worthwhile to have a solid drink in my hands. I'm got a Kangaroo Island Spirits wild gin, just with some regular tonic and a squeeze of lime.
Fantastic. And in true tradition of me, I have tea. I have a blend that this is called the Australian Breakfast Tea Blend from an Australian company called Teetotalers. So, first time I've tried it, had a sip, doing pretty good so far. It's all Australian grown tea, which is part of why they call it the Australian breakfast. So, we'll see how that one goes for me. Now,
Sounds good.
now, neither of you have been on the pod before that I'm aware of, and we usually start by asking you guests, how did you get into international law and what career path brought you to your present positions and jobs?
Well, I have a fairly traditional and uninteresting path, I suppose. In terms of my interest in international law, I've always had a fascination with international politics. And as a child, I had a real love of the marine environment in Antarctica. And I used to ask for a book on either the marine environment or Antarctica for my birthday every year. And I still have my collection of books, which is now much expanded. So when I went to law school and I kind of started studying international law, I was really excited to find that I could actually think about marine issues and Antarctic issues from a legal perspective. So I went on to do a master's degree. I started a PhD, which I actually didn't finish for personal reasons, but I was offered a job at the University of Nottingham teaching contract law, of all things. And I actually have some early publications in contract law. And I just sort of really went from there. And I moved out to New Zealand about 20 years ago. And I've been really lucky in my career in that I really pretty much only teach and research in international law. So a real privileged position to be in.
That's a very fortunate position. Now, how many of those marine environment books in your collection have you written
Oh, well,
or
I
contributed to?
quite a few, quite a few. In fact, I have. In fact, actually, not that the listeners can hear, but I'm in my study, and behind me, I actually have a view of my bookshelf, and a good portion of that bottom shelf are actually books I have contributed to. So, a few.
Fantastic. Camille?
My journey is a little bit different to Karen's, although, like her, I suppose I had a goal. I discovered international law, like many people, during my undergraduate studies, for me at the University of Adelaide. And then I suppose I chose every path that came in front of me to pursue it. So I did the Jessup Moot, and then I had the great fortune to work as an assistant to a member of the International Law Commission during the meeting in Geneva while I was doing my honours project on a topic that the ILC was working on. After a short diversion as a judge's associate at the South Australian Supreme Court, I joined the Attorney General's Department in Canberra as a graduate, desperate to work in the Office of International Law, or OIL as we call it here in Australia. Where I did end up, I had a fantastic time in OIL for many years and would recommend it to anyone as a place to work and to learn and train. I worked on all sorts of general international law issues. I ran a team called General Advising, in fact. But I ultimately fell into law of the sea and fisheries as a specialty. And along the way, I did a master's in maritime studies at ANCORS, and then later a PhD at the ANU focused on international fisheries law. And a few years later, I made a career switch from government to academia. So my current role at ANCORS is my first and only academic role to date. And in some ways, it does bring me full circle because much of my teaching now is teaching back to government officials and professionals, including in the degree that I took. And of course, ANCORS is a very policy-focused centre, so perhaps we could say that my research apple hasn't fallen too far from the government tree.
Fantastic. And I'd just like to say, I almost did my PhD at Nottingham and I did do my PhD at Adelaide. And Camille, we shared a supervisor because one of my MPhil supervisors was Don Rothwell, who, as I understand, supervised your PhD.
Yes, actually, along with Rob McLaughlin.
Yeah, well, and Rob McLaughlin was
Yes.
my MPhil supervisor and one of my PhD supervisors. So yeah, it is a rather small world in international law in Australia and New Zealand, isn't it?
Mhm.
Sure is.
Yeah. Okay, so now before we get into the question of generative AI, can you first tell us a bit about the journal you both edit and the people who publish in it and read it?
Sure. So, Ocean Development and International Law, or ODL, it's a specialist journal. Publishes work on the law of the sea broadly defined, so essentially all aspects of international and comparative law relating to the oceans and activities on, in, or under the oceans. And I'm sure all your listeners are aware that there's a lot going on in the law of the sea field at the moment, whether that's deep sea mining or charging tolls to traverse the Strait of Hormuz.
And on the note of charging tolls, I'd like to say I thought we finished that argument when Selton lost to Grotius on Mare Classen versus Mare Liberum, but apparently not.
There we go. President Trump is bringing all of these issues back. The journal was established in 1973 and remarkably has had only 3 editors over that period, over the course of a 50-year period. It was founded by William Burke, kind of a grandfather figure in the law of the sea. Ted McDorman edited it for over 20 years, and he will be known to many of us. And I took over at Ted's request in 2019, and Camille joined as deputy editor in 2024. It's read by academics, practitioners, government officials, students, kind of anybody really working or researching in the field of the law of the sea. And our aim is to publish high quality original scholarship from established and emerging thought leaders. We have a really strong commitment to publishing the work of early career researchers. We also want to ensure we have a global scope, including researchers whose language is not English as a first language, and also gender balance. We've got an editorial board of 28 academics and practitioners from all around the world, although not actually from Africa. We are missing representation from Africa. And for those interested in statistics or such matters, we are a Q1 Scopus journal. Our acceptance rate is around 12%, although it's actually likely to be lower this year because we've had a record number of submissions. And we have well over 100,000 annual article downloads. And for now, we actually still publish in hard copy 4 times a year.
There you go. That's a pretty comprehensive rundown of the journal. So, for the benefit of our of students listening or early career scholars listening, can you tell us about what the review and editing process at ODL is like?
Yes, I will do that reasonably briefly and also to provide a context for our discussion on AI. I think this is really relevant. Every manuscript that's submitted to ODL is sent to Karen and me. So one of the two of us reads every single manuscript that comes in. And between us, we undertake a preliminary review of those submissions, which results either in a desk reject decision or a decision to send the article for review. We personally manage the correspondence with the authors and with reviewers. So we communicate the outcome of reviews. We provide advice to authors where necessary, and we manage resubmissions and acceptance processes. But perhaps most importantly, definitely most time consuming, we work directly with authors to edit their manuscripts and ensure high quality publications. So that's one of the things we really pride ourselves on at Odal, is developing a constructive and trusted relationship with both our authors but also reviewers. As Karen mentioned, we have a fantastic editorial board, and Tamsin is a member of that board, so thank you. But we also call on Law of the Sea experts from around the world in our review process. So part of developing and maintaining this relationship is our direct communication with the reviewers and with the authors, which we conduct from our own emails rather than using an automated system. That's now rather unusual, and we have had to fight and continue to fight to keep those personal processes in place, but they're very important to us.
As someone who does a reasonable amount, I don't know if it's a lot, but a reasonable amount of reviewing for Odal, I actually really appreciate that. I appreciate that I can email you and know that it's an email that you're going to see rather than just going to an unmonitored no reply inbox. It makes a difference from a reviewer point of view. I will say that.
Thank you, Tamsin. We will pass that on to our publisher.
And they can, if they want evidence, they can listen to the episode.
Indeed.
And for anyone looking for more information about journal submission and review and editing processes, we have done an episode on that back in episode 60. So if you want to go into that into more detail, you can go listen back to that episode. But on to our main discussion, which is generative AI. So in April of this year, so 2026, you both formalized a generative AI policy for Odal that prohibited the use of generative AI in submissions and peer review of articles for the journal. Can you talk us through this policy and the decisions that went into crafting it?
Sure, I'm going to kick this off, but I would invite Camille and you, Tamsin, to kind of chip in at any stage. So I think kind of beginning with a disclaimer, neither Camille or myself profess any particular expertise in AI per se. And what we're going to say about AI is in relation to the type of research we publish in Odal. So we do accept that AI may well play a legitimate role, generative AI may well play a legitimate role in other types of research, particularly quantitative research. So we're just really talking about the type of research that we publish in Odal. So I guess to begin with the background of what led to our decision, like many editors, most editors, I would imagine, we started to see a year or so ago the odd article being submitted with obviously hallucinated references. The first couple we picked up on preliminary review, but then we had kind of one or two go out for review. Unfortunately, they were picked up by reviewers. I find that kind of the idea of hallucinated references quite interesting because it sort of is an odd phrase because it sort of almost detaches this idea of these references from the author. And of course, actually, once they're included in an article which is submitted to a journal, at worst, at best, it's sort of poor scholarship. At worst, it's academic integrity. But of course, they are quite a good indication that generative AI has been used. So at that point, which was kind of late last year, we decided we needed to have a proper discussion about whether and in what circumstances, we would be happy for authors to use generative AI and how we saw generative AI sitting with kind of Odal values and what we're trying to achieve with our journal. And we obviously needed to make a decision quite quickly because whilst we didn't have many submissions, which we thought were effective, the direction of travel was pretty clear. So as we kind of outlined, a few moments ago, Odal is a journal that publishes original research, which makes, or at least we hope it makes, a substantive contribution to our field and is trusted by our authors, by our reviewers, and by our readers, to really to represent the very best of the law of the sea research. And we felt that actually the use of generative AI for substantive research and writing is fundamentally incompatible with those goals and with our values. And essentially, it risks undermining the integrity and quality of Odal, but also generally actually risks undermining scholarship in the field. So in short, we came to the view that we don't want authors or indeed reviewers to use generative AI in their contributions to Odal. And of course, we don't use it in our editing processes. So we weren't operating in a vacuum. We don't operate in a vacuum as a Taylor and Francis journal. Taylor and Francis has a generative AI policy. Under that policy, first, reviewers are not permitted to upload manuscripts to generative AI or to use generative AI to generate reviews. And we completely agreed with that position. And in fact, the way we interact with our reviewers, as you indicated, Tamsin, is quite a personal process. So we had no concerns, actually, that generative AI was being used in the review process. So all we really did with that was we updated our information on the website and on our review form just to confirm that. But with respect to articles and authors, Taylor and France's policy is a bit more permissive than we were actually comfortable with. So it asserts that authors remain accountable for the originality, validity, and integrity of the content of their submissions, including references. But it does permit authors to use generative AI as long as that is clearly acknowledged. Importantly, however, the policy also allows for individual journal editors to impose a more restrictive policy, and that's what we did. So what's our policy? So our policy is actually quite simple, or at least we hope it's quite simple. Our approach, our policy is essentially that we do not permit the use of generative AI tools such as ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Claude, anything that falls within that category, to generate substantive content. This includes both research and writing, but our policy notes that tools for spelling and grammar checking are permitted and they don't need to be declared. Now, there's obviously scope for interpretation, and in some ways we would have preferred a stronger statement to outrule it altogether, but that wasn't really possible, taking into consideration our publishers' policy. But our view is that generative AI should not be used to generate ideas or structure, should not provide sources, and should not write the text of articles. So essentially anything which is considered to be substantive. Before we finalised our policy, we circulated it and indeed our reasoning to our ODAL editorial board. We asked for views and feedback. We received a very large number of fulsome support for our policy, and not one member expressed reservations. We also talked to the editorial team of our friendly competition. That's the International Journal of Marine and Coastal Law. We have a very good relationship with David Freestone, who edits that journal. And of course, we liaised with our publisher, with whom we've worked really very constructively over this. And I'd like to acknowledge that. It's been a good discussion. So once we finalised and updated our website, we informed our board. We then posted quite a lengthy article on LinkedIn to kind of inform people more generally. And interestingly, that article gained quite a lot of traction. We got a fair amount of unsolicited support from people within and indeed outside of the Law of the Sea community. And what really surprised me is that to date, we actually haven't received any criticism or pushback, from anybody. And that has surprised me. So that's essentially our policy and our thinking behind it. There are a couple of just points I'd just like to finish up on. There are some fish hooks within this and some challenges that, we are facing. So first, obviously, having this policy doesn't mean that we obviously don't receive any submissions with substantive generative AI. I rejected one this morning on that basis. But we do have a clear policy basis for rejecting the now on preliminary review, so it makes our job a little bit easier. Second, more importantly, there's obviously room for interpretation with our policy, and we acknowledge that. We very much regard it as a work in progress. I think we will have to respond as technology changes, as attitudes change. Neither Camille or I have a monopoly on publishing ethics, and we'll kind of want to remain responsive. So we don't regard this as set in stone, and we will kind of respond to readers, reviewers, and the discipline at large. Interestingly, what I have noticed on LinkedIn is that we're seeing signs that some journals are adopting a more robust policy. I don't know whether you've seen the announcement by the Diplomat a couple of weeks ago, which has taken actually a more robust approach than we have. Third, we're aware, obviously, that enforcement is quite challenging, and it's, articles with substantive generative AI will slip through. We've put in place a number of measures to address this, and Camille's actually going to talk a little bit about some of those measures, I think a little bit later on. And then finally, we are live to the fact that this is actually a really complex issue, and there are different views, and there are, some problems that we're going to have to try to face. There are different views on kind of the ethics of using generative AI within the legal community. Not everybody takes our view. We are live to the fact that our policy might impact non-native English speakers more significantly than native English speakers. And also, we're kind of live to the fact that there is a tension in the role, particularly of big publishers and AI, and that includes Taylor and Francis. With respect to kind of that first issue, there are different views. We kind of accept that. We accept not everybody will agree with our approach, and we're absolutely okay with that. We don't mind that some people may well not agree. If authors wish to use AI, that's fantastic. You can use it elsewhere, publish elsewhere. As long as it's fully declared, then obviously readers can make a decision as to whether to use that research or not. In terms of kind of equality and non-native English language speakers, as Camille has said, we really pride ourselves on kind of working with those authors. And we absolutely have taken articles which have got great ideas or really important information, but require an awful lot of work. There are times which Camille and I have kind of spent 3 or 4 whole days on editing an article, which may well go through 2 or 3 iterations. At the time, it can be quite painful, but at the end of the process, it is generally all worth it. The latter issue I mentioned, I think, is more complicated. And of course, most big publishers now, allow AI to trawl their databases to train AI. And Taylor and Francis does that. I'm sure you as an author, Tamsin, have received emails, as I have, kind of asking permission for your
I mean,
work to be included.
I also edit a book series with Taylor and Francis through Routledge. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
whole thing.
Yeah, so and I think that's a real problem, and I can see that does not really sit very consistently with our policy. We are asking authors not to use generative AI, and yet their work without generative AI may end up as being part of that database, which is then trawled for AI. And we're live to that. We don't like it. In reality, we actually can't do anything about that at this stage. But it is, I think it's something that it is worth talking about and people being aware of.
Yeah. Camille, did you want to add anything to kind of from your perspective as the other editor
I think
on
it's a
that?
really comprehensive answer with a great range of perspectives in it. And as Karen's highlighted, some difficult tensions, particularly around that publishing aspect.
Yeah, and the question I'm going to have before we move on to the next one is how are you dealing with the fact that more and more translation software is running off a generative AI base rather than just a machine learning algorithm base, which is, as I said, they're related but distinct.
Well, I think that's a real challenge, and I don't think we fully got to grips with that. I mean, I would say, actually, in relation to a teaching scenario where I sort of restricted AI quite significantly this year, one thing I did not restrict was the use of Grammarly, and I rather naively thought that Grammarly simply corrected your grammar, and now understand that that is absolutely not the case. It can rewrite.
It has become another generative AI
It
platform.
has, it has. So, and that I think goes to the point that, we need to keep our policy kind of under review and kind of thinking about this. So, ideally we don't want people to use that generative AI to generate text. But as you say, I think it's becoming increasingly hard to actually avoid generative AI. I mean, if you do a search on Google, I've now trained myself to try to uh, have my eyes lower to avoid the AI summary with
I
the search
have
on Google. It's really
removed,
hard.
yeah, I've removed Google. I've moved to DuckDuckGo's no AI extension as my search default because I can't stand the incorrect slop response that the Google gives you automatically every time you're like, I just want to know where I can get some tacos. And you're giving me a rundown generative AI slop response of the history of tacos in Canberra. I'm like, I don't care. I just want to get some tacos. Yeah. So yeah, as I said, I've had to remove Google search from all of my devices because of
I,
that.
I think that's part of the challenge too in defining a policy is defining AI slash Gen AI.
Yeah.
Where do they start and stop? And um, in the discussions we had as part of developing the policy, I think we both had to acknowledge that this isn't a black and white policy with sharp edges. This is a continuum where we hope people can see what we're trying to achieve, and there'll be some fuzzy edges, but this is really the best that we can do in terms of defining at the moment. And it's probably the same issue everybody's grappling with in their teaching,
Yeah.
assessments and describing AI policies for assessment.
Yeah, and look, as we said, there's lots of really valid and valuable machine learning uses. Like I've used voice recognition software for all my scholarship since 2012, and that's a machine learning algorithm based bit of software, but it's not an AI, and I think it's worth, kind of just not a generative AI, and it's a hard one to kind of work out where that line sits.
Well,
And translation software, I think, is one of the hardest ones because there are lots of people who are writing in their native language and then running it through a translation software as their starting point, but now they could be falling foul of that generative AI adjustments to their writing rather than just getting translation.
and to that point, I mean, my research, I've spent a lot of time looking at state practice and a lot of time using Google Translate to
Hmm.
translate legislation from some language I can't read into English. So again, it's a continuum.
Yeah, I've had to do that with a lot of human rights case law when I've been dealing with queer, like the impact of law on queer lives, and I've had to check it and say, is the translation I'm getting through Google Translate accurate with people who do speak the language? It's a, there's not sharp edges here, as you said.
Mm.
No. So as I see it, and we've kind of already raised that a little bit, is there are three connected issues with the use of generative AI in legal scholarship, given all of this. And the first is how do we ensure the integrity of what we read, what we cite, and what we assign when we're teaching? Second is how do we ensure that our own scholarship is not tainted by the use of generative AI by others in their scholarship? Because, good citation practice doesn't guarantee that a paper that you're citing that you've read doesn't contain an AI hallucination. And third, how do we deal with what is, reporting otherwise, and I don't know how bad it is at Odell, the flooding of journals with Gen AI submissions, given all of the, unacknowledged labor that goes into keeping quality journals functioning.
Well, I'll take that great set of questions, Tamsin, and I do think it's a really good way to summarize the issues that have sort of emerged. Starting with integrity, your first question, and I'll answer this from an odal perspective and also a personal perspective in terms of the things we control and what we can do ourselves. So, as Karen said, we are very aware that enforcement of this policy isn't easy, but we have put in place a range of measures to address it and try to ensure integrity for odal. So, for example, we no longer accept submissions with in-text references. In the past, we accepted manuscripts for review without being picky about formatting or reference style on the basis that they can be put into style during revision if the article passes review. But now, in light of growing use of AI, we require all submissions to use footnotes for clarity and transparency. And then we pay much closer attention to footnotes and references as part of the preliminary review process. And where references look as though they have been AI generated, or as Karen said, hallucinated, we reject. Before we send an article out to external review, we put it through a plagiarism program, which we can also use to get some information on whether AI might have been used. And we rely on our fantastic reviewers in the review process. But I think I would say that from an odal perspective, our best bulwark against scholarship being tainted by AI is the fact that we work with authors personally in a hands-on way to edit every article that's published in odal. So even if a manuscript containing AI references gets through preliminary review and peer review, and so far that's only happened once, it will almost certainly be caught in editing as it was, where we are checking the accuracy and appropriateness of references and requiring, for example, proper pinpoint citations and checking them. So that level of editing makes it easier to spot some of those telltale indicators of generative AI that we've all become so aware of. In particular for us, things like over-reliance on open access materials, heavy reliance on master's and PhD theses or grey literature, articles from repositories like ResearchGate. Another indicator would be repeated use of page ranges rather than a pinpoint reference. And because we edit every article closely, there's a good chance we'll spot these things. And if we do, then we'll dig a bit deeper. So I think that is useful in terms of ensuring the integrity and accuracy of what we publish, and therefore what our colleagues are reading and citing and hopefully prescribing as reading from our journal. Your second point about what steps we can take to ensure that our own scholarship is not tainted is probably a harder one. I don't claim to hold all the answers to this, so I'm very happy to hear what you think as well. I think it's reasonable to expect in our field that journals and editors take a strong approach and implement policies to ensure, at a minimum, the articles they publish don't contain hallucinated references as the sort of primary on the face indicator of the use of AI. It's probably not reasonable to expect journals to check whether the papers that those articles are citing, which are papers that have been published by other journals following their own processes, contain those references or AI use. So at that point, it becomes a systems problem. We need all journals to adopt rigorous AI policies. So for us, as Karen sort of indicated, this is really a question about maintaining high quality scholarship and good academic practice. And perhaps journals and authors who fail to take a responsible approach to this should ultimately pay the price in terms of their reputation. At an individual level, perhaps it's a good time to reinvigorate our own approach to research with a renewed criticality in evaluating the sources we're using, both as authors and as readers. And thinking about the question you posed, I was, just thinking back to the simplest thing. In teaching, many of us use the CRUP test, asking students to consider value of sources based on currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose. But perhaps in the age of AI, we need to expand this test to specifically include consideration of reliability in terms of AI. Of course, that's difficult as an author, considering whether or not the work you are citing may have been written using Gen AI or contains hallucinated references would be a big and time-consuming task. But in some ways, it's not completely different from the processes of judgment and evaluation that we already engage in on those other bases, at least with respect to considering which journals we rely on. So choosing good journals as an indicator. And then I suppose flowing on from that, we can consider where we publish our own work and support journals which have strong policies that don't permit the use of generative AI to create substantive content, and journals which have editorial processes in place to guard against it. And we can raise it in journals where we're involved as reviewers or as board members. Ask what the policies are when you're taking on a review. So I don't think we can solve that one overnight or person by person, but as a group, I do think the cream will rise to the top, and hopefully journals which adopt and implement responsible policies and authors who practice good research will be rewarded. And then finally, on your question about journals being flooded with AI submissions, we have definitely seen an increase in submissions over the last few years. Every year, I think, has been a new record for the last 3 years or something. Our submissions have probably tripled over the last 5 years. But we don't attribute all of that increase to AI. There are a range of other factors, the increase in read and publish agreements, which have made it easier for authors to secure open access publication. And also, I think, a growing interest in law of the sea. And, with some humility, the reputation of the journal. But having said that, the use and even just the existence of Gen AI necessarily generates extra work, as Karen's already said. The requirement to check manuscripts, not just for plagiarism, which we could do using software, but for hallucinated references, which is much harder, is extremely time-consuming. And it's not time that you're spending to improve a manuscript or provide meaningful advice to an author, which you can feel good about, but it feels more like time you're wasting to confirm that someone has engaged in poor academic practice, and so that you don't waste the time of reviewers. And we haven't really discussed this aspect, but there's also additional time and mental load, I would say, to read manuscripts which have been written or edited, perhaps, using generative AI. And I'm sure you and listeners have seen these from students. Pieces which look perfect and well written, and on the surface, you're like, oh, phew, this will be easy to skim over and think that they're good. But then when you read them more carefully, you realize they're very bland or generic, repetitive. Often, I think they have slightly contrived analogies or headings which are overwritten. They use unnecessarily complicated terms in ways that have no real meaning. And we see these. Screening for them adds more time to preliminary review. We don't want to send these to reviewers. But funnily enough, it has had the effect of greatly increasing my appreciation for the messy manuscripts with imperfect English and human errors. So, as Karen said, we really try to publish scholarship from all over the world. And now, when the language needs work, feels even more meaningful to strive to work that out. And I think in that respect, I would refer to the approach Karen just mentioned from The Diplomat. They prohibited all use of generative AI, even for language editing, on the basis that they're committed to working with authors to publish original and compelling content, even if it has grammatical errors. They will help authors bring the article to the professional standard required, which I think really enunciates what we're trying to do as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
On the note of, the student things coming through, I had an LLM thesis that's, I thought, oh, this is not well written until I got to the point where they said the International Seabed Authority is involved in peacekeeping. And I'm like, right, at that point in time, we're using generative AI. And I sent it back, saying, I'm not dealing with this.
Well, I mean, I think what you can get out of those answers to those three questions, probably
Yeah,
the same thing at the basis of everyone is, I think what we can do is what we're doing, establish a clear policy
yeah,
and ensure that policy is implemented through robust editorial and review processes.
yeah, yeah. Karen, did you want to add anything to that kind of really great answer from Camille?
No, I think you said it yourself, Tamsin. That was a really great answer. So I'm going to let that sit where it is.
Fantastic. So, without getting into the ethical issues to do with generative AI, which are manifold, or the environmental issues, also manifold, um, but you can get into those if you want to, actually. I don't care. Talk about it if you want to. I'm here for it. What impact would you say generative AI is having on legal scholarship?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think even if we don't get into the ethical issues or the environmental issues, there are issues that people need to think about. If you are driving an electric car or taking the bus, but you are also using generative AI, you really need to think about the impact you are having on the environment. But if we kind of stick to the impacts on legal scholarship, and I guess it's probably really too early, or I think it's too early to kind of talk about impacts at this point. But I think there are some really significant risks, which I certainly worry about, and not just from an ODAL perspective, but actually much more generally. So the first risk is that I think it risks undermining trust in scholarship. And this is something I've really reflected on because I find I'm now reading ODAL submissions and, in fact, student essays with an element of suspicion. It's almost reversed the burden of proof. You used to read a submission on the basis of its merits. And then if something looked a bit odd, you would then kind of probe a bit more and see whether there was an issue. But it's almost reversed that. I feel I'm starting off almost with an element of suspicion, which I really don't like. I don't enjoy. I don't think that works. And we're kind of, we're living in an age of disinformation and misinformation. And I think we really need to be able to have sources that we can trust, and scholarship should be something that we can trust. And I think if that trust is undermined, then I think that's actually potentially a really significant long-term problem. So that I would suggest is kind of one real risk. Second, I mean, generative AI essentially draws on information which is available. It's all kind of all out there. It kind of digests it and then it regurgitates it in a way which now is actually quite readable and professional, even if it's slightly bland. But of course, it doesn't create anything new or original. As we know, it also risks reproducing kind of existing biases in scholarships, and there's a significant risk of conscious or unconscious plagiarism. I'm really worried that we could become kind of quite deluged with unoriginal, biased, and morally suspect research. And it's going to become increasingly difficult and costly, not least in time, in sorting the wood from the chaff. There's already a huge amount of scholarship out there, much of it good scholarship. It's really difficult to keep on top of, the great stuff. let alone trying to keep on top of a huge amount of material, a lot of which is not worth reading. So I think actually, there's a risk that it's just going to add to scholarship in an unhelpful way. And therefore, longer term, risks actually a general decline in the quality and originality of scholarship, kind of a real case of quantity over quality. And of course, that decline, will ultimately or could ultimately filter through to what students learn, to what lawyers practice, and even kind of resources available to judges. So I think there could be kind of a real kind of dumbing down, race to the bottom with generative AI. Third, I mean, I think if generative AI becomes increasingly mainstream in scholarship, then legal academics or, academics from any field, could feel under pressure to use it. Because to not use it means that they are less efficient than their colleagues, and that could obviously have real implications in terms of promotion and advancement. So I think here there's a responsibility on not just kind of journals and authors, but also on faculties and universities, to think really carefully about how and when generative AI should be used in research, acknowledging that there are disciplines where its use potentially makes much more sense, but not necessarily in law. My own university is quite in favour of generative AI, sees it as solving a whole range of problems. The New Zealand government is in favour of using generative AI. But I think there are some real considerations that we need to think about there. And actually, I would suggest that universities have a responsibility to protect scholarship and indeed scholarships and indeed scholars that aren't using generative AI. And then I guess finally, and probably actually most importantly, I think there's a risk that researchers, particularly early career researchers and research students, will lose vital skills or potentially not even develop them altogether. I don't know about you, but kind of every article I write, every book chapter or contribution to the conversation I write, I learn something. I find, the process, not just substantively, but actually the process, I learn something. I'm constantly honing my writing skills. As a baby lecturer, I cut my teeth on writing case notes in contract law, under the mentorship of some really fabulous colleagues from the University of Nottingham. Every time you get feedback from a reviewer or an editor, it's an opportunity to learn. I learn as an editor. I find my writing is improved, through that actual process of editing. And I think once you start outsourcing, parts of the research process or the writing process, you're going to start to lose skills. Now, of course, we've always outsourced, and we, of course, often outsource to students. But there's real benefit in that because we're training the next generation of students. But if we're outsourcing to generative AI, I don't really see quite what the benefit is in that. A colleague of mine actually quite recently described this process. She was talking about students, but actually it applies to researchers as cognitive surrender, which I think is quite a powerful phrase. And I think that's a huge long-term risk. And kind of going back to Odell, we want to publish research that is original, that contains new ideas or new insights or perspective, which has been developed by human beings, drawing on individuals' incredible experience and expertise, from all different types of contexts. We're not interested in publishing neatly packaged material generated by AI. I don't want to read it as an academic, and I certainly don't want to invest time in it as a reviewer or as an editor. So I do think there are some real risks, and we really need to think about this, broadly as academics, but also as lawyers, as students, and as university officials.
Yeah. On your example of you're constantly learning every time you do that. So I just recently finished a monograph manuscript with Douglas Guilfoyle on piracy that we jokingly refer to as, a greatest hits tour. I wrote chapters of stuff that I've been working on the subject matter since the start of my academic career. And I can say that there was more insight and more polish and just better presented arguments in what I'm writing now on the thing that I have. And my positions haven't changed, but it is still better produced now because I've spent years reading other people's scholarship on it, having that challenge my thinking, having to refine those arguments and having to kind of package them with new information. So yeah, I would agree that I'm still getting better at scholarship that I've been doing for my whole career now, even just because I'm reading and writing on it. So Yeah, I just as an example. And I also jokingly tell, and not only half jokingly tell my PhD and honors students that this is the worst piece of research they'll ever do in their career, which is not to say it'll be bad, but it's just to say that it'll always be better as you have more practice. So I wholeheartedly agree that outsourcing that work so that you don't have to think about it is bad for your scholarship. But Camille, I've rambled. I'll let you kind of give your thoughts on this question.
No, look, I mean, I can't disagree with anything that's been said. I think, in all honesty, I have a sort of deep-seated fear that I've missed something because there are people I greatly respect and admire who I know to be very intelligent human beings who've really taken to generative AI and engaged with it and sort of run off with it. And I do feel like there's two echo chambers. There's the pro and the anti, and you can just be in one of them. And so I suppose I try to have an open mind to read and learn, and I think for me, probably a piece of work to do is to understand actually how it works. I don't understand the underpinnings of AI, and I'd like to so that I can reject it from a position of strength. Um, but I think also the tensions that Karen has referred to, there was quite a few in there that resonate with me. The idea is there's some ideas there about equity, about using it or not using it, whether it's ethical to use it, and if you don't use it, to be ethical, whether you suffer in other ways, particularly if you're, say, an early career researcher or someone teaching multiple courses and, who would find it useful to be able to use AI for some things. Um, I think there's a tension also between research and teaching. And as Karen said, many of our universities are almost obliging us to not prohibit the use of AI by our students, but to regulate it, to craft policies, which we then also need to enforce about how they can and cannot use AI. And that isn't exactly aligned with what our journal policy might be, for example. So we might be telling students they can use it while we don't use it. I think there's a few systemic sort of tensions that have to work their way through.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for a really rich discussion on what you've done with Odal and how that kind of then is reflective or not reflective of the broader international law scholarship space. Yeah, but we do need to wrap up. And in wrapping up, we usually ask a non-international law question about escape routes, about what you're reading or listening to or doing that takes your mind off international law. But in season three, I've still been given a free hand on this question. So as a former chef, I'm asking all about food. So, Karen, Camille, what is your ultimate comfort food? Where can you get the best version of it? And where can listeners get a solid recipe to make it at home?
Well, I might kick off, Tamsin. As a former chef, you would be appalled at my lack of cooking skills. I don't really cook. And actually, one of my favourite comfort foods is probably toasty and chips, which I have about 4 times a week. But given you've asked for a recipe, I think I am going to suggest a dish which is both an ultimate comfort food, but also a fantastic dinner party dish. So it kind of does both. And it's one of my few party pieces. And it's potato dauphinoise. So essentially, it's potatoes which are layered with lashings of cream, butter, Gruyere cheese, garlic, thyme, and it's in the oven for about an hour and a quarter. If you are doing it for a dinner party, you can do it the day before, which is quite handy. But if you live alone like me, it freezes quite well. So you can actually make a big batch and then freeze portions. And then on cold winter nights, you can get your batches out and microwave them. Optionally, you might want to put meat or vegetables with it. But otherwise, you can just eat it on its own. And it's quite delicious. I have an excellent recipe, which I actually cannot remember where I got from. It's now in my little recipe box. But if anybody wants it, they can email me and I would gladly share it. It's very easy. Even a non-cook like me can do it.
And I love a potato dauphinoise. I used to have to make it in kitchens all the time. And you can, if you're re feeling really fancy, pan fry it after to reheat it to give it a really nice golden crispy crust when you reheat it.
Oh, I'm going to try that.
Yeah,
That
you
sounds like
can
an
pan
excellent
fry
tip.
it. You can pan fry it in butter and then like flip it and then put it in the oven to finish it for kind of 10 minutes to heat through
Mm.
as your reheat method, and it's delicious.
Okay, so cook it with butter and then you fry it in a bit more butter.
Well,
That's
so yeah, cook
ideal.
it in butter, fry it in a bit more butter. Very French.
Perfect,
Twice
perfect.
cooked.
Camille?
Well, since Karen's given you a savory, I'll give you a sweet. And my foolproof go-to dessert that tastes great and makes you look a better chef than you are is the chocolate mousse. I use the recipe from French by Damien Pignolet. Six
Oh,
eggs.
Damien's lovely. I used to work for him.
Well, you've probably done this before. Six eggs, one really good block of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of caster sugar, and a dash of Cointreau, which I reckon makes it healthy. There's no butter, there's no cream. It's rich, but it's not too sweet. You can put some berries on top. It's way more impressive looking than the skills required to make it.
I usually use Nadine Ingram's version that she taught me at MG Garage, but yeah, when I was at Bistro Moncur, I worked for Damien for a bit. So yeah, no, it's a really good cookbook. Just generally great French bistro food and good chocolate mousse is sensational. Well, that is all we have time for. So thank you very much for joining me for this discussion. And for our listeners, we will catch you next time. Bye bye.
Bye.